So hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson. I'm a registered social worker and therapist in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of experience working as a social worker and 5 years working as a therapist. In this video, I want to talk about just aspects of disenfranchised grief as it applies to the scapegoat in a narcissistic family or dysfunctional family system, and talk about particularly when a parent dies. This could be considered a parent who has a level of narcissism and that difficult personality is now gone. And the family unit, as it's essentially centered around that narcissist, there could also be perhaps your other parent who has narcissism or at least some form of difficult personality. And then you have a family system that if you're the scapegoat, you might have alliances in your family, other times you don't. But it could be the case that you're the scapegoat and you don't have any alliances. So it's the case that your mom or father has passed and you have somewhat healthy grief. A person you've known your whole life, you're dealing with a lot of complex emotions. When I've worked with clients in terms of grief in general, they say everyone grieves differently. There's a common model in terms of how typically people go through grief, and usually it's shock at first. Some like think that they're going to phone you or they're going to be there like how they used to be. Your mind is in shock of this person no longer being in your life. And then sometimes people go through anger, and then ultimately though it's to acceptance. And I think it takes time, right? Tends to take years sometimes for you to process all those emotions and really understand what that person meant to you. Some people will say too, let's say that you have limited contact or you went no contact with your parent prior to their passing. And there is some advice out there, and people might have given this to you, and you might have considered yourself as, well, when my father or my mom passes, am I going to regret not being in contact with them? Because you never know how long someone's going to live, and you don't want to squander time. I think it's normal to have that sense that time is finite, and we never know when certain people in our life will pass. I guess that's just the reality of life as well. When you go through someone in your life who, like, you have a narcissistic family, and it could be a narcissistic parent. Typically in these situations, maybe it's in your personal life, you were in situations where there was this dynamic, and then you ultimately came to terms with the fact that from a young age, this has been your family of origin. Some, I think, understand from a young age that their family is very much dysfunctional and unhealthy, but there are people that suppress it or don't connect the dots. They start to do their own therapy, and maybe they are starting to have conflict with their parents or family. I've spoken in other videos, other people have spoken about just how the scapegoat gets blamed, and they're the identified patient. So they tend to have a lot of the sense that they're the one that has the mental emotional issues. And typically in these families, a narcissistic family, and that's what I want to get to in terms of this grief, is the notion that they shove everything under the rug, right? They get hostile or find a discussion of emotion as threatening. It doesn't go along with the narcissistic family narrative, what could be considered the shared fantasy, to take Sam Vatkin. The notion that there's these rigid roles and there's ways in which the family operates. So when someone passes, you have your genuine emotions as a scapegoat, but you find that your family, superficially, they might talk about maybe at the funeral or at the celebration of life, or they might with family friends share how they have grief and that there is this loss in the family. But then when yourself having your complex emotions, maybe perhaps you were limited in no contact and you started to come to terms with your parent likely having narcissism. Maybe in some sense you have grieved that relationship even prior to that parent passing. When they do pass, it's usually a complexity of emotions, right? It can be one, relief, just because that person did mean a lot to you, but then because of the lack of differentiation and the way in which they constantly were making us into an object and instrumentalizing us and not seeing us for who we are, like subjugating us to themselves. And it's likely the case that through our differentiation or individuation, we probably spent many years trying to communicate with that person. But I think for many of us, came to the terms with that person that they're essentially not seeing us and there's not a way to get through to them. And they also don't take responsibility. And I'm reading this book on character disturbance. It goes through many of the mental models of the narcissist and how they act in this aggressive way towards their nearest and dearest. And if that's your father or your mother, it's likely the case that you've had to set boundaries with them. And then when they do pass, it can be a relief, but it often brings up a lot of emotions. And it's always like your family's always in you in some sense. I think these are memories and emotions that are like shaped us as when we're younger, right? And it's not going to be something that we're going to just get over overnight. At least that's not what I understand in terms of the grief process. But with the scapegoat, they're typically the healthier person in the relationship or in the family, and essentially they are. But they've, for many years, have been projected upon from the family and basically been the trash can or taking all the shadow of the family, and the parents probably saying harsh things to them over time. So they do know the family inside and out in some sense, right? But it's just to say that when the parent passes, all those emotions are still there with them. So if you went no contact with your parent before they passed, it's perhaps the case that if you have an enabling parent or a narcissistic parent, and the siblings also go along with this narrative, then you have these complex emotions and the way in which the family is projected upon you. You had righteous anger towards your parent, and in a lot of ways you had every right to be upset and angry. In that process, there's a concept of the Darvo, so they reverse roles and they become the victim essentially and deny. And because you're the scapegoat, aren't able to speak up. If you do, you're seen as the difficult one or having issues or crazy. However, the family smears your name or finds ways to explain it away. And it's just the sense that you're too much and why don't you just get over this? And yeah, maybe that person has done that, but it's really not that bad. That's just life, or that's just the way he is. So there's always a sense of trying to minimize and essentially gaslight you to say that your feelings, your emotions, your reality testing, your perception is inaccurate. But yet, at some level, I think all families know in some sense, they just don't care, or they're just invested in other things. I think for us, we tend to commit ourselves to a certain level of values and truth in our life. And for the narcissistic family system, that's foreign. I'm reading that book again, the character disturbance book. There's many ways you can make a distinction between a codependent or a person who's a scapegoat or a black sheep. Typically what I find in a lot of my clients is this notion of neurosis and being a bit neurotic. In that book, he makes a distinction between neurotic individuals and characterally disturbed individuals. And so he says that therapy in a lot of the therapeutic circles, even understanding narcissism and difficult personalities like the cluster B personality disorders, he believes is still framed often, or the people that are working with them either avoid those people because they're too difficult and they do understand the way they are, and maybe just come to terms of thinking that those people don't change. Others try to get them to see insights, make it the level of them being ignorant. But he says how to weaponize that and use that against the therapist. There's already transference happening for the therapy. They typically want to minimize and feign ignorance, like they didn't understand in some sense. But his point is that these characterally disturbed individuals do often know essentially what they're doing. They just don't care. They'll use different ways to get what they want. And if that means trying to persuade or manipulate the therapist, they will. His point of intervention in that book is making a distinction between neurotic individuals and characterally disturbed individuals, because you have different approaches with each one of them. But with a person who's considered more neurotic, they would likely have anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders, but they still have the ability to self-reflect and insight. They take responsibility and, if not more, internalize and take on more, like in terms of what's going on with their relationships or what's occurring in the family unit. So you could consider the scapegoat likely having a level of neurosis, like anxiety, attachment, wound, complex trauma. They have the ability to have insight, right? Whereas a characterally disturbed individual, a therapist might work with that individual and say, I just need to convince him what he did wrong. But according to this character disturbance book, they actually do usually know what they're doing. And it's about confronting them. He talks about ensuring that the therapist puts themselves in a position where they don't allow the narcissist or the difficult personality, the characterly disturbed individual, to manipulate the process. So I just wanted to explain that in terms of the theory from that book. But the reason why I mention all that is because if you consider the scapegoat having some degree of neuroticism, they're able to have insight. The characterly disturbed individual knows what they're doing and doesn't have insight. When you're in this family and you have a parent that's passed, like your father or your mother, if you have genuine emotions and feelings you're going through, and you have disenfranchised grief, even friends and other people might, like laypersons, might not really understand fully what you're going through. And people expect a person to grieve when you lose somebody. And that's what's happening. But at another level, you're grappling with holding this collective shadow. You're also observing, I think, usually how your family's operating and how they show up. And in these families, typically emotions are like shoved under the rug. So again, it's all about image. And so I think like someone like Sam Vatkin would say the family's in a shared fantasy. And when a parent leaves, there's like a power vacuum. And so someone needs to fill that role. And I would say it can be often the case that the partner, the wife or the husband of the family, they don't, like, one, they make it about themselves typically. And they, because they're so self-centered and self-focused, yet again, you're the scapegoat or the neurotic one. And again, that's just the words from that book, but that you're processing your own emotions. But essentially, the parent, it's likely that they don't think that you have what to say. That's a weakness, and they don't have those emotions. They make it about themselves, but they don't really grieve in some sense. And I'm sure they do. It depends on the dynamic and the situation. But then again, they usually make it about themselves and how they're victims. Typically, because they're getting attention during this time, they make it about themselves. And it's more about image and how this looks to others. But then you're an individual and a son or a daughter going through your own grief of losing your father or your mother. But the sense is that you're not even allowed to have these emotions or these feelings. And when you do express them in the family, narcissistic family, they typically will gaslight you and not discuss them and make it as though, I don't know, it could be weakness, but they could also just put it back on themselves and focus on how they're grieving and how hard it is for them. And at the end of the day, it's not like you're trying to make it hard or not give them empathy. But again, you are your own person too, and you've had your experiences with that as your father, your mother. And you think that your mother or father would be there for you and attend to your emotions and have a level of sympathy. In these families, it probably will be framed as tough love and let's just get on with it and we have to move forward. Usually that's not explicitly said, but it's more like it's deflected. And then the scapegoat just gets the signal that, okay, because typically in life, we just go along with the way other people are acting, and we just assume that's the way to go about it. A lot of us will make notes when this happens, even just a mental note. At the time, we just said, that's odd. I'm trying to express myself. And again, I want to be present for my siblings or my parent, but they seem to be playing the victim, and it's all about them right now. And another aspect I wanted to speak about too is just how a sibling, likely you have a sibling that is resentful towards you, and it could be all your siblings. They control these relationships because when there's, again, that mention of the power vacuum, when a parent dies, that's like a difficult personality. And if it's the father, or it could be the mother, but usually it's personality that the whole family was basically orchestrated around. Maybe in your life, you were the scapegoat, so you started to limit contact or go no contact. But the family has a memory of you resisting that relationship or having difficulties with that person. Even though at the end of the day, you were probably just trying to keep them accountable and actually trying to address it. But they, again, because of their own unhealthiness or sickness, had to project upon you and blame you essentially. Yet the family system aligns with that parent and family friends. So the perception is that you're the difficult one and you're the one that has a difficulty with that, your parent, or your mom or dad. When you have the funeral or the celebration of life, you're dealing with complex emotions. At one level, it's relief because of all of the difficulties you had to put up with that person and how for many years you tried to have a genuine mutual relationship, but they always distorted things or made it about themselves. And essentially, if you take that dual mothership model, they're making you out to be almost like your mom to you, but you are also like a mom to them. There's just this emotional fusion where boundaries aren't respected, and they also likely mistreat you in the devaluation or discard phase, or when they have narcissistic rage or injury. If you have siblings that are part of this system, there's this power vacuum. If there's a golden child or a brother or sister who is resentful towards you, they likely know that you have some level of discord with your parent. They will want to control that relationship or step up in a way that power is likely and more responsibility is going to be given to them. Again, a lot of families are complex and there's different ways that this can show up. But I would certainly say that for the scapegoat, they aren't able to mourn fully, and they aren't able to turn to anyone in the family because they don't have the capacity or willingness to listen, essentially, and be present to your emotions. And you try to even maybe have conversations with them, but I think you also realize that they don't want to. It's all about image management, especially when a narcissistic parent leaves. You'll find, I think, it's maybe your older sibling or could be any sibling essentially, but they start playing a bigger role, and they might, again, there's many dynamics in a family system, but perhaps they start adopting aspects of that parent. They are trying to take that role. The family system is this emotional fusion, and it could be like the mother's still alive or the father's still alive, but they might, in some odd and weird way or emotionally fused way, to take Bowen, they start to lean on that person more. And almost you could consider like a grooming aspect of that person starts to become like, whether it's like there's a sense of the collective undifferentiated ego mass. So you look at the person and you think that they're intentionally doing this, but then I think you can also understand that the system itself is unhealthy. But of course, the parent ultimately is the hierarchy. And so I think the onus is, even though siblings have their own will and make their own decisions, I think the ultimate responsibility within a dysfunctional family or narcissistic family is the narcissistic parent or parents. But certainly siblings, especially as you get older, can take more and more ownership or have this sense of dominance or power that they are very much living by. But again, I think where the scapegoat typically will get stuck in the situation is that, going back to that book, Character Disturbance, he talks about how the neurotic will tend to self-reflect and inquire, whereas the character disturbed individual typically won't do that, but have cold empathy, so they intellectually understand what happened and what they did, but they also have selective memory, and they'll always frame things as being the victim, but they'll never usually admit to being a victim because they know how that shows in society. But basically the neurotic thinks that people are like them. But I think when you've come face to face with a narcissist and with a dysfunctional family, you come to understand that people are different and they're not like you. But even then, I think the neurotic tends to self-examine and they say, how could someone be like this? These questions do mystify us or leave us puzzled because it's canny the way these individuals operate in the world. But according to this book, the characterly disturbed individual will weaponize that empathy and perception, and they're looking for insights in the way in which the neurotic can. They'll tend to drop things and maybe they won't. They just tend to assume the good in people. And therapists can also do this. There's definitely a criticism to be made about how these disturbed individuals, do they come from trauma or are they actually a victim? But I think what this just understands is your complex emotions of grief with your family, with your parent that's passed. Some of it, you do miss maybe aspects of them. Human beings are complex, even if they have a personality disorder. In some sense, the family won't let you grieve, and then they will dismiss your emotions. And so that gives you the sign, I think, the signal that, okay, it's not safe here to discuss my emotions. And they also making it about them. So all of a sudden now it could be the mom or the father, but they're somehow the victim. And they were sort of like, usually it's like they're hard done by. And you need to serve them in terms of being there for them, when essentially the parent should be there for the children. And again, there's always ways in which families, someone's sick, one might overfunction or underfunction within a family unit. But essentially there's the orders of love and the hierarchy within the family. Parent, narcissistic parent, is making it all about them. And to take the dual mothership model from Sam Vatkin, they're sending you the signal to tend to their needs. Just understand this complex grief you're dealing with. The family has this power vacuum, and it could be a sibling stepping up more and taking more responsibility, but it's never negotiated. Like with a healthier family, right? People would come together and they would discuss to some degree these emotions. And I think healthier families are starting to understand more about emotions. I work with couples, and a lot of it comes down to these core emotions. John Gottman. You understand that you look at how the parents were in terms of their anger, their sadness, their pride, their fear. And then you also understand each person in that couple, how their emotions show up when they argue or when they have a gridlock issue, but also just how they express it naturally. And because we are obviously rational beings, but we have our emotions. And typically when we're our nearest and dearest, those emotions are coming out and they shape us from a young age. But again, it's not safe typically in these homes. And some of it's just cultural conditioning, because I think a lot of homes will push emotions away and just get on with life and focus on survival needs. But there's a saying, right? Emotions have to go somewhere. So they typically get expressed usually with anger or various coping mechanisms that are not healthy. You might have a sibling who very much wants to control the narrative and stay on top. They are likely going to create a situation where they don't let you grieve, and it's like they think that maybe because you went at odds with your father or your mother when they passed, that somehow you don't care about the father or the mother. When it was typically the parent doing that to you, you were willing to address the matter and communicate, but they were always using this Darvo and tending to not take responsibility or take any ownership. But the sibling, again, just to go back to that book, Characterly Disturbed, they know these things usually about you, or they know that you're neurotic and you see the best in them. Because you're the scapegoat, the parent has done that to you from a young age. The characterly disturbed individual knows how to, they see it as weakness typically, and they think that they can manipulate you. And that's what's sad about this, is that these are your parents or your family, and when you're going through your authentic emotions, that wasn't safe for you to express. And they're also giving you the look or the certain eye when you do grieve, and as though it's not genuine or authentic, when in fact it's typically them who have no genuine authenticity. They want to control the narrative and the false self of the family. There's this power vacuum, and emotions are seen as a threat. The parent also probably wants to contain the narrative, so it could be the case that, hey, it's like you say to your mom or your dad's, I'd like to speak at the funeral or the celebration of life. But it's maybe the case that if you're the scapegoat from a young age, the image was very much protected. So how the parent was reflected from you was seen as very important. And so you having your own individuality or expression on your own terms is seen as a threat. They don't see you as a person. And so when you do try, you want to express how that person meant to you, but they might be suspicious that you'll say something negative about the parent. Those kind of things happen in some dynamics in some families. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the scapegoat often doesn't have the ability to express their authentic, genuine emotions when their parent passes. And it's disenfranchised grief. And often because friends and other people don't fully understand this, it's probably odd to you if you haven't had all the education or understanding of scapegoating and narcissism, but you think, am I the only one that feels this way? Things just don't add up. And the family wants to move on really quick usually and act as though nothing happened. And then, or they'll play the victim, especially the parent, if they're narcissistic, will like the attention they're getting from being a widow and use that to their advantage for narcissistic supply. You want to be there and be present as a good son or daughter, but they're making it all about them, and you're not allowed to grieve. When you do, it's seen as a threat, and they could also, there'd be siblings who are taking advantage of the situation and don't want you to have any independent relationship with either parent. And they might smear your name about the fact that you didn't have a good relationship with your parent when they passed. This is all happening when the scapegoat just wants to have a normal, loving relationship with their family. They have this disenfranchised grief, so they can't fully express themselves. And the family always just wants to focus on image and on the perception and not any genuine or authentic emotions. And it might be until later on in your life that, when you do go no contact or It could be both parents passing, but you essentially process more of these emotions because it's likely the case for the scapegoat. One, because they had to be there for their parent who's this victim or needed you to be at their every whim. And you also had siblings who were subjugating you and putting you down and making it sound like you're the difficult one. And there's this guilt complex in the way in which they weaponize your neurosis to some degree, like your anxiety or your depression against you. And the characterally disturbed individual essentially also typically wants power and control. And so you likely have a sibling who is going to take over for that parent in terms of the power, at least. But they also might start acting and looking like them. And the parent that's still alive might rely on them for a form of narcissistic supply and favor them, making them the golden child. And then there's this pseudo-mutuality. When you speak up about that dynamic, they say, no, that's not the case. Why are you making this into a big thing? And so they'll always dismiss it. But yeah, I guess I wanted to talk in this video about aspects of the grief process when you've lost a narcissistic parent and how the family will not allow you to fully process those complex emotions. Characterly disturbed individuals doesn't typically have that empathy. They make it about themselves. When we grieve, it's like we're at our sense of vulnerability, and we are in some sense. It's just we're going through a difficult time. And then to have our family see that and weaponize it against us and not allow us to express those emotions and also not allow us to share what that meant to others. Because it's typically, you could have a narcissistic parent that's quite controlling of the image. So you might want to speak up at like a funeral or a celebration of life and they essentially don't want you to, or they think that like they're suspicious of it and they really want to contain the message. So again, just in these families, there's a lack of differentiation. There's a sense that there's disenfranchised grief. I just wanted to talk about the way this shows up in a narcissistic family. Of course, there can be many dynamics and situations, and it's complex understanding these aspects. Certainly within my experience, I've seen different expressions of this. I guess I just wanted to make a video because I don't think a lot of people are always talking about disenfranchised grief. And that's a term that came from the 80s, and it was more applied, I think, just in general to disenfranchised grief. And the first time I heard that was in Rebecca's book, Blamed and Shamed. She speaks about scapegoating and used that term just in the way that the scapegoat is grieving a family that they have never had. And I think it's one that society doesn't recognize, but then two, they are grieving a relationship and a childhood that essentially wasn't there or those people weren't present to them. And so it's just a peculiar way to experience life because typically in a healthier family, when someone passes, like I've met obviously a lot of my clients who have very close relationship with their family. And so when that person passes, it's devastating for them. They meant a lot to them and were good people to them. And that would make sense of why you'd have that grief. But when it's been cruel and always made it about themselves, and there was just this way in which there's just emotionally fused mess and you're finding you're always out of sorts around them. And then when you do pass, there's a bit of a relief typically because maybe you went no contact. When they're alive, you still probably feel guilt in the sense that maybe I should reach out to them, or with holidays coming, people might think, should I reach out to my parent? But when they're past, that option is not there. And so there isn't that ruminating or fretting about what could be or what I should do. So in some sense, there can be relief too. You can live your life more independently now, and you don't have to always go to them for outsourcing your reality testing or seeking their judgment. In this video, I wanted to talk about different aspects of grieving within a narcissistic family system, particularly if you've been the scapegoat, and how having that disenfranchised grief typically isn't recognized by others, and also how your emotions and your grief can be weaponized and used against you when a parent passes. And then also how siblings perhaps have resentment towards you and don't want you to have an independent relationship with your parent, and essentially will fill the void of the power that's left when that parent leaves, and might start to be more like that parent, and then also essentially maintain the family system's this rigid order. And at the end of the day, where you needed the place where you could be safe to grieve, that wasn't provided for you. Your emotions were weaponized against you and seen as probably like a level of weakness, and they essentially made it about themselves. When a healthier family you would have some processing of these emotions and a way in which to be authentic about the situation. But in these families, because of these characterally disturbed individuals, it's all about image and impression management. And because they're almost like young children, like according to Sam Vakin, the narcissist is 2 or 3, then you just don't have that capacity online. But because you're perhaps maybe a more neurotic individual or someone who introspects, you might just have assumed for many years that, all human nature, all people are alike. But I think you've come to terms with the fact that you are dealing with disturbed individuals and typically people that are very immature. And it's not even about immaturity, it's just about these people who have this aggression towards you and have been very aggressive towards you in your life, and how that can be incredibly difficult to process, especially when a parent dies. Thanks and have a great day.